Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's lecture, Lab 7, Good Manufacturing Practices. We're going to talk about GMP internal auditing today. Now, before we get into that, I'll walk back just a little bit and talk about the Good Manufacturing Practices, which is the topic for this week's live session on Tuesday. Then we'll talk about the GMP audit process in several details, and I'll tell a little bit about your assignment and the project, and how this will relate. That's kind of the plan for today. Alright, so what did we talk about this week? Well, we talked about good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. These are the policies, procedures, rules, programs, and practices, habits, and whatnot that are all in place in a business for it to control the food safety in production. Now, regardless of what kind of business that company is, like how big it is, what kind of operation it does, if it's part of the food industry, it does any sort of production or any related business that has to handle food, they have to follow some sort of GMP rules and have it in place. And you can find a list of those regulations in 21 CFR 110 and 21 CFR 117. And in fact, they're really the bare minimum that companies can do to really enforce food safety standards within their business. These are your basic things like your pest control, employee hygiene, employee training for that matter, facility design, stuff like that. That list from lecture was not exhaustive by any means, but it shows you some of the most common that are out there. Many food companies want to go to a standard beyond what the normal GMPs are, and there are many third-party GMP audits, or you can have a HACCP Part C program, or you can have a GFSI certification. Those things build off of GMP programs because you have to have a strong GMP program already before you can have a really strong Harp C HACCP program or whatever you want. And because of that, and the fact that they're required to maintain any sort of food safety in the company anyway, there's a name for these GMPs. They're often called prerequisite programs. If you want to know the difference between the two, well, simply wearing your hairnet to the food production floor when you're working, that would be a GMP. But then the list of rules and the program and the employee training that got you to learn that you needed to put the hairnet on when you're starting production at work, that would be the prerequisite program. So like one is just the rules and sets, like everything that's encompassed, and then prerequisite program is specific to like an actual written like thing that's in place and enforced based off those GMPs. And despite the name GMPs, it's actually not restricted to food manufacturing by any means. In fact, I even said that before that GMPs were actually originally intended for things like drugs, pharmaceuticals, and stuff like that, and food just happened to come later. And it extends to other variations in the food industry or other like parts of the food industry besides production, I should say. So, for example, distribution, they have their own set of GMPs called GDPs, or good distribution practices. If you work on a farm, you do good agricultural practices. If you work in a quality control lab doing tests for other companies, so you have to follow good laboratory practices. And if you ever work for a hospital doing like some sort of nutrition research, there'll be good clinical practices, so on and so forth. So, not only are these mandatory, some variation of it will apply to every industry within the food industry. And even if you go across to things that don't have anything to do with food, like drugs, you'll have to follow their own set of GMP requirements also. So they're very important. Now, GMPs are so important that's not enough to just have a system in place written down. You have to make sure that's enforced to some degree and that your employees are actually following it. Well, the best way to do that in terms of a routine check is to audit it, or to have someone actually take a deep look at the different things going on in your facility to make sure that things are working as they're supposed to. A routine audit like this, it really depends on the company, but it could be anywhere from every month to every, say, 3 or 4 months, or maybe 6 months. It just depends on the food safety system that the company has in place. But regardless, it has to be done by someone who is in QC or QA, inspecting the facility, make sure they scour every part of the facility to make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to, and to point out any problems if there are and get those fixed. And that's called an internal audit because it's done by someone who's actually employed by the company. So an internal audit can only be done by a QC or QA person who is hired by the company. And that will be the focus of today's lecture. So what typically goes into making an audit? Well, a lot of things actually. If there's not already something that the QA or QC person can use to conduct their audit, well, one such thing needs to be made. So basically the QA or QC, whoever's responsible for it in the company, it's typically QA if there's two different departments, Well, the QA person will actually take a look at the production, so like just the day-to-day operations. They'll take a look at where things are stored, what sort of records are kept. They identify different things in the facility, like the storage units and the equipment, and then they'll just sort of plan an audit based off that. So once they understand everything that goes on in the facility and where everything is, they start making a checklist that they go off of when they conduct their audits. When they finally have that written up and corrected and ready to go, they actually do their first internal audit and they walk through the facility, just walking through the facility as operations normally happen, checking the different spots, usually in the middle of production if possible, just to because a lot of it includes things like you can only see when people are working. So the internal audit usually starts from the same reference point. On my first job, I usually used the outside premises as a starting point, where you just check the outside for trash and stuff like that. Then you go in and you use a pre-planned route, like you go through the warehouse first, like the storage area. Then you might go to the refrigerators and freezers. Then you might go to the actual manufacturing site where people are actually producing the food, taking a look at that. You might look at the mouse traps after that, then the security doors, so on and so forth. The point being is that you want to pick an order, and you want to plan ahead your route in advance, and you want to stick to it every time you conduct the audit. This is much more efficient, both in terms of the time it takes to finish the internal audit, and also making it easier for you to spot things because you're doing it in a more organized and orderly fashion. I can tell you just from experience that trying to do everything out of order gets messy really fast. You tend to forget a lot of things. So trying to stick to a consistent order usually helps. Anyway, during that walkthrough, you're touring the facility, you're looking at different things. You actually want to check off a bunch of boxes on your list. So, are people wearing their proper uniforms? Is the floor clean? Is the freezer working properly and the temperature is being maintained in proper condition? You just want to make sure, like I said earlier, that the employees of the company are actually following the GMPs that your team has written down. You want to make sure that the policy is actually being enforced, so to speak. After all, you wrote those GMP programs or food safety protocols for a reason. If they're followed, they reduce the number of food safety incidents that you have at your company. So that's one big component of it. And then the other two big components are first checking the calibration of equipment. So one pretty normal routine in more so in QC than QA, I think in the general sense, but I've had to do this for most recently my current job and also my first one. Whether it's a scale, a temperature monitoring device, lab equipment, really anything that requires any degree of accuracy and precision, that needs to be serviced every year, maintained for calibration to make sure it's accurate. So you want to check the schedules for that, both on paper and as you're looking at the tags that are usually on the equipment as you walk through the facility. That can get a little awkward if, say, you were to find a thermometer that a production worker was using and it turned out to be out of date. But I have swapped it before, so usually I take a couple thermometers or scales or whatever with me if I suspect anything will be due for recalibration soon. But that's why preparing for the audit in advance is so important. You'll anticipate that ahead of time. And last but not least, you'll be checking the company's food safety records, like production records, any sort of maintenance calibration logs, employee training records, just to see if there are any holes in your documentation, and you want to get those fixed if you ever see them. So that's usually what goes into an internal audit, like at the most basic and generic level. I don't want to get too specific because every company has their own variation of the internal audit, and they can look very, very different between companies. I do my best to make sure that when I do these presentations that the things to look for in an internal audit, they apply to most businesses. But depending on what specific sub-industry you work for in the food industry, you might have a unique set of requirements that are only for that particular type of business. And so just keep that in mind. There might be some other things that are not covered on here that you may end up running into if you work in certain industries like seafood packing or like, say, like, I don't know, pasta manufacturing or something like that. They will have some things in common, but like they might have their own unique requirements too. Just keeping that in mind. Okay, so the internal audit is supposed to make sure that employees are following GPs as they're written, making sure that they're following the rules and they're complying with everything. But it's very, very common to spot non-compliances, we actually have a name for that. It's called deviations during the inspection or the audit. And so those particular deviations have to be addressed at some point. The sooner the better, of course. In some cases, that they be addressed urgently. If you just need a simple correction, like let's say someone left a can of Coke on top of a mousetrap, well, just take the can of Coke off and throw it away. A simple action like that would be a correction. A lot of really minor things. There are things that need to be taken care of during the internal audit, and they're not good as far as GMPs are concerned to neglect. But they're not the most urgent or the most dangerous of things, and they're things that are easy to fix. Corrective actions, on the other hand, are where, let's say, the food safety problem is more severe, or maybe it reoccurs all the time, maybe it causes constant issues. That's when not only you need to fix something, but then you also have to do something to prevent it from happening again in the future. When you have a corrective action, you have to file a report, start it up, get your team together to sort of discuss the issue, investigate, maybe talk to some people in the production workers who might know something that you don't, ask questions, sort of investigate, and really try to figure out what the root cause is. So it's like the main thing that's causing the issue, like at the center of it all. Something that you can change to prevent it from happening again. And because of that, actually, corrective actions, there's another name for it. A lot of companies are now using the term corrective and preventive action, or CAPA. And if you ever apply for a job in the food industry, you might see CAPA sometimes. That's what that means. Let me give you a slightly better example, although that can of Coke thing actually did happen at a job of mine. Let's say you're cooking something for a safety reason. Like say like cooking something that like a soup that needs to be cooked for like 4 hours or something like that. Um, I guess that'd be more like a stew, really. But anyway, moving on. So let's say you're cooking this stew and you need to cook it for 4 hours. Let's say you had to cook it at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 of those hours. Well, let's say during that cooking period, a production operator notices that the temperature dropped for, let's say, a few minutes, down to like 245 F. Well, they turn the knob up to keep the fire up a little bit higher, and then the temperature goes back up, and that'll just be a correction, just making a simple fix. Now, let's say you guys already finished packaging that soup after it's been cooked, and you guys assumed it was 250 F for 4 hours, but the QA person like checks those records for the temperature recorder and noticed that it's actually been under 250 F for most of the cooking time, like let's say 3 of those hours. Well, now you got to dump the product, you got to write the report for disposing of it, or reprocessing it. Maybe you need to recook it. And you got to make sure that people actually are paying attention to it. So the corrective action in this case would be not only like taking control of the soup that wasn't cooked properly, but then you also have to like make sure that the employees responsible for the cooking go through GMP training again. Maybe you want to like write another report to say like, okay, determine like whether or not the soup is still safe, whether or not to either cook it again or to just get rid of it. You might see these examples on these slides about ATP swabbing. That's for sanitizing equipment before use, and it has to be extra strict when it comes to say like dairy, or if you're using the equipment to make anything raw. Dairy, I think that's just the industry standard. Even if you pasteurize it, improper sanitation can cause problems even with proper cooking temperature. And for raw food, proper sanitation is your only protection against microbial growth in some cases. So those examples there are pretty good for what corrective action versus just simple correction would be for those as well. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask me. But I just want you to know the difference between these two different things. If you want me to sum it up very simply, basically when you conduct your inspection or your audit, you will see some things that are not supposed to happen. We call those deviations. The fix could be pretty easy and quick to do, just a simple correction, or maybe require a little bit more involvement because it's a very severe problem, or it's a problem that's been happening over and over again and you want to get rid of it. And that's called a corrective action or a CAPA, corrective and preventive action. So, yeah. All right, so let's talk about the actual things we want to look for in a typical internal audit. And this is how I usually like to start. I like to start by checking the outside premises. That's just the outside of the building. The outer premises of the building needs to be kept clean or well maintained because there's a lot of stuff happening on the outside. First, food delivery trucks are coming in with deliveries of their ingredients, or maybe they're picking stuff up. from the factory to a warehouse. There's always that risk of spills. People are coming in and out. Suppliers, contractors, employees, health inspectors. There are a lot of dumpsters that are always kept on the outside. Not all of them are in the back. Some of them are out front. Uh, that's actually been the case. Actually, I think in both companies I've worked at. Actually, both the factories that I've worked at. Uh, what else? Yeah, so just in general, you want to make sure the outside is clean and well maintained because there's a lot of stuff going on, and all of that could actually jeopardize the safety of the food if it's not controlled in some manner. So basically, just when you look at the outside, is it pretty clean? There's not a whole lot of trash going on the outside. Not very dirty. Does the equipment look like it's in working condition, like the loading docks, the trucks? Uh, is the ground clean? Which, believe it or not, is actually harder than you think. Um, Depending on where your warehouse is located, it might be very easy for trash to accumulate on the outside. Like if your warehouse or your factory is located in the middle of a really crowded city, a lot of people are walking by. There might be some communities nearby where there's not a whole lot of trash and sanitation, or the quality of that service is not very good, so things tend to pile up. That happened to me at the company that I worked at in downtown LA. Whatever the case, this is usually a good first step to check because a lot of food safety issues can happen just by poor maintenance of the outer premises, just as much as it would be poor maintenance on the inside. So I usually like to check this first. Part of that is also because it's just kind of a convenient starting point. I mean, especially if your office is detached in the factory, which it was in the case of the first company I worked at. It's very easy to just start from the outside because you're going from that direction anyway. You might as well check the outer premises while you're waiting to go in. So it's usually a good thing to check first. Both because it's often a convenient starting point and because, the cleanliness on the outside can actually do a lot for food safety on the inside. So it's a key control point in some ways for some businesses. Here are some GMP violations that you would absolutely see on the outside. They're pretty common and they could definitely pose food safety issues. Um, the first one there is a dumpster that's been left open, or worse yet, propped open. I've actually never seen it propped open in practice in my time working in the companies I've worked at, but it does have a tendency to be left open because a lot of people are throwing stuff out during the day, and it's really inconvenient for them to have to open and close it every time. But by leaving it open, it makes it really attractive to things like flies and whatnot, which you don't want in your facility because that attracts pests, basically. So that's one reason you want to make sure that's actually kept closed when it's not being used. Um, just know that oftentimes you'll see it left open. It's pretty common. The second one will be if like certain fences you check, especially chain links, they're kind of bad condition. I'll explain more why that's a bad thing, but like basically, if you see like say a fence, like in this case here in this slide, sort of the bottom on the right there, it's kind of bent. You don't want that. And this is even the worst I've seen of fences that are in bad condition. I've seen ones where it looked as if the fence was completely smushed in, as if like something ran over it. And so you definitely want those replaced ASAP. Although you have to consider like the budget and time for that as well. The manager may not actually get a new one installed until it's um, other parts of the fence actually need to be fixed as well. So, but at the very least, you can point it out during an internal audit. That's something to look for on the outside. The other thing, and it's a bit more urgent, is so there's always a front of a warehouse where the trucks are loading their food into the warehouse and vice versa, the docking areas. Those have gates, like warehouse gates. And those are sort of the plastic or metallic-ish gates that you see, kind of like a door to a garage, sort of. Not exactly the same, but like the same concept. It's letting things in or out. You want to make sure that thing is in good condition and it's completely sealed. If it's dented like this, actually, it doesn't even have to be this bad. It can be just a small dent, just large enough for a mouse to slip through. You want to report that to a manager. That has to be fixed ASAP because you don't want things sneaking in. And this would be a good way for them to do it if it's not fixed right away. So if you ever see a door like this in that condition that leaves a gap like that, you got to report it right away. That's something that needs to be fixed. Same thing, by the way, if you see like a gap like that in, say, like a window or door or something, or maybe like a hole in the wall, that's got to be patched up really quick because that's not a good thing. In the case of something like a door, that's more for like keeping insects out, and then for windows, that'd be keeping insects and birds out. So same idea. You want to keep certain pests from coming in, but different type of animal that's involved. That's kind of the only difference. Okay, so food defense or security. This technically is more of its own thing. It's not really food safety per se. When the industry says food safety, they usually refer to things that happen unintentionally to cause food safety issues. The real purpose of a food defense system is to protect against intentional food safety issues. But food defense is still such an important part of maintaining a company's QA program and making sure that their food is not adulterated in any way, regardless of whether it's intentional or not, that it's often a very key component of GMP audits anyway. At least in practice, it is. So one of the things that you need to check is to make sure that the security system is working in some way. So you might want to check for certain security doors to make sure they're working okay. You want to make sure that any sort of outer fences and gates are in good condition. I've seen some fences and gates that are bent in such a way that someone can actually sneak under, like say a chain link fence that's sort of dented, or they can pull it back and get in. Some factories have barbed wire in front of them, and that can be in bad condition too, to the point where someone can climb over it. In fact, when it comes to visitors or people just going into the factory, anyone who is coming in or out that isn't an employee, that has to be very carefully documented. So every time I've toured a factory of some kind, I've always had to sign in with the front desk or with some sort of security team out front. And if there isn't one on the outside, there certainly is one on the inside, a receptionist of sorts, who still has to check in with you. A company has to keep track of the people who come in and out, basically. So they have a record system. Maybe it's just a simple checklist. Maybe it's a sign-in sheet. They might even have some software. I know that certain bigger companies have electronic systems for that. Actually, one time I toured a noodle factory, and they did something unique where they had us all sign in on an iPad in front before going in. We even had to take a photo and stuff like that. That was kind of cool. During an internal audit, you'll have to look around and make sure that all the people in the factory are wearing their appropriate uniforms or name tags, or some other sort of means of distinguishing them from other people. You want to make sure that anyone who's handling the food directly is actually an employee of the company. And that may not seem like much. In fact, in a small company, it's pretty easy to do. But for a larger company with easily over 100 employees, you have to have some sort of indicator. And a uniform, a smock, or ID card will be the only way you can tell. If someone's not an employee of your company, but is wearing some sort of ID tag, saying visitor, or maybe they're a truck driver from another company, that's okay as long as they have something indicating that somewhere on their person. So, ID tag from another company, or, a shirt showing the logo of the other company that's delivering the food, for instance. Those are all acceptable alternatives. Last but not least, if you have any access to the camera areas, you want to make sure the cameras are all working properly. It's very common for cameras to malfunction because they need maintenance, so that you might want to do that as part of your internal inspection as well. And so that's food defense. And if you get nothing else out of this when you start working in the field, just know that when you're working for a company, your ID card is very, very important. It's not just to distinguish you in the company and to make sure that you're official. Sometimes it's your only access point to certain, or your only access card, I should say, to certain areas where you need to work. So if you need to enter your lab, you need to enter the manufacturing area or anything like that, you got to have your ID card on you. That's how it works these days. Some companies still use a key code system, but that's a lot easier to hack. So if possible, the ID card is the best way to go, usually for most companies. Right, so I've talked extensively about pest control in the last lecture. Let's talk about it more in depth for the things that you actually have to look for when you're doing an internal audit. So one of the first things you do is when you look on the outside, you need to make sure that the groundskeeping of the premises is well maintained. Keeping the landscaping or the gardening, the overall care of the outside as far as plants are concerned, that's got to be in good condition to make sure that food safety can be assured inside the facility. And here's the reason. A lot of foliage on the outside, so a lot of trees, bushes, and whatnot, if they're not well cared for, it makes it a lot easier for wild animals to settle there and make their nests and whatnot. So, for instance, when dealing with birds or trying to prevent them from entering the facility, you want to make sure that it's hard for them to set up a nest in those areas. So you want to trim the tree branches, make sure they're not out of control. You want to keep bushes under controlled growth and make sure that they're cut down to a certain size. That's why you see them in such regular, proper shapes on the outside, and whereas like a bush in a wall would be like out of control. It's for the same reason. Your factory might be next to, like, say, some railroad tracks or some other area where there's a lot of dirt, and there might be a lot of wild weeds and plants and animals growing there or like living there. That could create some problems for your facility as well. So there should be some way for you guys to address that too. Whether that's to actually maintain that area outside, that you technically don't own, but nobody really owns. Um, or in other cases, you can keep it under control so that if it's property that is owned by somebody else and they don't take care of it, you have some protection against that side to keep animals and plants from spreading over. So, for example, keeping like a really well sealed off gate with some extra like pest traps and whatnot. If you're located right next to, say, like an abandoned factory, and that abandoned factory is full of dirt, debris, weeds, and whatnot in there. And of course, if there are leaves that end up on the floor or the parking lot or the entrance area near your factory, you want to get those swept because even that can harbor insects and whatnot down below if it's not taken care of right away. So sweeping is more important than you think, and it's one of the things you check for in an internal audit. Now, I apologize if you're eating while watching this presentation or reading these slides, but learning to recognize pest droppings is going to be very, very important when you work in the food industry. And so learning to recognize them is going to be a key skill to have. And so on that note, if you see on the left, you see typical examples of what mice and rat poop looks like. Or we call them rat and mice droppings. They're fairly small, but they're pretty wide, especially rat droppings. They kind of look like miniature beans. Obviously, you don't want to touch them, but if you want to compare them size-wise, the rat's poop is basically slightly bigger than grains of rice. In this case, it looks like a long grain rice there. And then on the left, you have mice poop, which is a lot smaller. They come out in smaller, rounder pellets too. Um, as far as where you would typically find them, rats and mice like to nibble holes into like the packaging of dry foods, because dry food is something that they can easily access as a food source. And then you might end up seeing some like rat droppings or mouse droppings either nearby or inside the bag itself. So you want to check like packaging for holes, or maybe look on the floors underneath like the pallet racks, or like sometimes even on top of the bags, or if you look between bags, you might find some signs of that if you know that rats are in the facility somewhere. Or even if you didn't, that's one way to check at least. So you want to take a look at the storage racks and the where everything is stored in the dry storage, like the flour and rice and whatnot, and just see if you see any poop there. And that's what it looks like. You might have repeat problems of this, or you might have large amounts of poop in one particular inspection. In that case, it's a sign that probably some of the rodents are making a nest nearby, or they're making like a home essentially to like reproduce. And so you want to look for any possible access points in the facility. They're really, really small, but you see a little hole nibbled through, like a wall of some sorts, like this one on the right. That's a sign that rats have burrowed in, or sorry, mice and rats have burrowed in, and they made a home basically in that area. So you want to seal those off when you have the chance. And yeah, they're really small actually. That's kind of unusually large back there. That's kind of zoomed in-ish. They tend to be really hard to notice unless you like look very carefully on the bottom. So if you were to ever do this yourself in actual job, I'd probably carry a flashlight or something, so you can actually shine down on the bottom of the walls to actually see whether or not you have any signs of rodent activity there. As far as what to do about it, well, the only really fix you can have is to basically put in some sort of bait that causes them to hallucinate or get sick. Rat poison is technically legal in a lot of food plants, but a lot of companies are trying to move away from it, especially if they want to become SQF or GMP certified, because well, that poison is toxic to humans too, and so a lot of the third-party GMP standards try to get you to use something else, and alternatives are available, but they work more as like deterrents, where maybe they might be hallucinogenic, or they might be non-lethal toxic, but just some other way to try to scare rats away using bait. And a less violent, I should say, or maybe less lethal, but still valid correction for a single rat, like an isolated incident. You can find a way to sort of draw it out. Warehouse workers are actually really good at that. And so trying to lure it outside the facility is another way to go, at least for one or two rats, maybe. A bait box with toxic bait, like rat poison in it, that's really more of a last resort. It is legal, but it's not one that's ideal, I should say, if that makes any sense. The other thing you can do, but it's more preventive than anything, is a lot of warehouses and factories use a specialized kind of rodent trap. It's not the stereotypical trap you see in cartoons or the wooden spring trap that you see that you can buy at home. It's slightly different. And there's actually a name for it. It's called a tin cat. You can see on the left there, on the control tools section. How that basically works, and I have a video of it on YouTube in the GMP's playlist if you want to take a look at how to operate one. You basically put some bait on the inside. So I mentioned dry foods, they like that, but they like stuff like peanut butter and nuts even more. There's a little bit of hole on the front there. You can kind of see that black thing on the left there. The rat will sneak through that to try to get to the peanut butter, and they can get in, but they can't get out basically. The rodent is often left to die in there, which sounds unfortunate, but that's just often what happens, and I see that during an audit sometimes, although thankfully rarely. But the more humane thing to do, and one thing you can do if it's still alive, is you can release it, as long as it's far, far away from the factory. And that's so you can spare its life, while at the same time discouraging it from coming back. And last but not least, I mentioned fixing gates, doors, or sealing off like holes and gaps, like the mouse holes, for instance. That'd be another thing that you could do as well. So when I started working, I hear a lot about like how horrible rats are to deal with, and yeah, they can be a pain. But my personal nemesis, at least in my first 2 years of working in the food industry, was birds. Actually, I'm sure most of you have seen bird poop before. You see it on the sidewalks or on your car sometimes. But if you haven't, that's what that looks like. It's just a big white splatter there, or a little white splatter, depending on how big the bird is. That'll be one side of pest activity. You can actually see that not just on the floor, but sometimes you'll see traces of it on racks if you have a storage unit that's exposed to the outside. So that's not good to have either. Um, you might also have nests in your facility, and I actually haven't had to deal with pigeons, but I've had to deal with sparrows, and they tend to build like nests out of just about anything, just like pigeons. They don't even have to have like straw or anything. They can just pick trash from the outside, and they'll have like a nest with the egg in it and everything. So they'll try to reproduce inside the facility. So that's another sign of a bird problem. Actually, when I was working at one company, I think a warehouse job, um, we actually heard birds chirping overhead us, like on the ceiling somewhere. So we knew it was there, but we couldn't locate it. It took us weeks to find the nest. Though thankfully, our pest control guy eventually did find the nest. My point being is that these are two telltale signs of birds in there. I guess you heard birds chirping in there. If you saw one in there, that's obviously proof enough too. As for the fix, the best solution really depends on the species of bird that you're dealing with. But I know that a couple of these, two of these that are listed here, and then one other thing, have been proven to be effective before. So the first thing you can do is try to screen out birds using bird nets. We've actually had to install that once to try to keep birds out, and it worked beautifully without harming them. One thing you can do is deter birds, again, using non-lethal bait. Actually, I think toxic bait is either illegal or not permitted under certain GMP audit standards. But there's this hallucinogenic drug for birds called Avitrol, and you can actually lace bait or bird feed with that and put that intentionally in some areas away from your warehouse. So the birds are still attracted to it, but they'll eat that, realize that maybe this is not the best food source, and sort of leave because they realize maybe this is not the safest place for them. Avitrol, like rat poison, is also considered sort of a last resort solution. But to be honest, I've seen it pretty standard, at least in the pest control program that I'm familiar with the company that the first job I had contracted out to. But bird nets are definitely better if you can afford to have them. I also mentioned in a live lecture that you can use like shiny objects to scare away certain species of birds. That's specific to sparrows or house sparrows. Those birds like do not like shiny objects, and they tend to fly away from them. So what we did actually was we applied some sort of like shiny red ribbons or some sort of tape, some sort that sort of hung on our fences, and that actually scared them off. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do also is if you know those like the curtains or like those like plastic things that cover like freezers or refrigerators at like some grocery stores or some freezer areas like restaurants or whatever. Let's see. Yeah, here's a pretty good example of this freezer curtain. You can use that too to keep birds out. Sometimes that can be installed. They tend to be a little pricey though, so while they're effective, they're not the most cost-effective option, but they will work. And of course, if you have any gaps in walls or windows, or even a gate, like a door that's been like dented on the top side, you want those filled or fixed. That could also keep birds out. Get rid of any standing water, destroy nests if you find them, so on and so forth. Those are some other things you can do to take care of birds. Insects I haven't had to deal with as much, but they can be a big pain in the butt, especially cockroaches and ants. I haven't really seen any ant droppings, but here are cockroach droppings. They're really, really small. They look like grains of pepper almost. Let's just kind of zoom in to see what they look like. Um, you'll see bugs on the production floor, or sometimes evidence of them in bags and whatnot. That's definitely not a pleasant thing to deal with, but you will see that sometimes. As far as what you can do about it, most of the solutions I've already said that will work for birds or um, rodents would also be effective fine too. But the one other thing that works uniquely for insects would be bug traps. Now, a lot of what I said would be effective for birds and rodents would be effective for insects too. So a lot of this will look like repeats. But there's one unique thing to insects, and that's what kind of bug trap to use. You actually cannot use the type of trap that you might have at home or maybe in the office where it's like a zapper sort of deal, where like the flies are attracted to it, they get shocked, and then they die instantly. That's not a good thing to have near a production area because it's not sanitary. The corpses from that could actually end up contaminating the food or present other hazards as well. So it's not the best thing to have. What you want instead is something that works more like a sticky trap. So that brand there specifically actually uh, is of the specific type that the industry uses. Here's how it works. Basically, what happens is the Dynatrap, that's the name of the brand that sells this particular trap. What their machine does is it lets out like some sort of pheromone that the insects are attracted to. So mosquitoes in particular love like CO2 mixed with body odors. The mosquitoes fly towards these traps and then they try to enter the traps, and they sort of get sucked in and trapped in there, so they cannot get out, and eventually they die in there. So that's basically how that works. Similar traps, like some variations of this, where they fly in and they get stuck to like some sort of sheet of paper that's attached to it. That's another way to get rid of them too. But yeah, that's what those traps look like in the food industry. They don't usually use zappers anymore. You can actually get this kind of trap at home now too. Actually, they sell Dynatrap brand traps on Amazon, and then I'm not really going to show for them because I don't work for them. But if you're into that sort of more less inhumane way to kill insects sort of deal, I guess that's something that might interest you maybe. So if you have to deal with mosquitoes in the summer again, maybe that's something to consider. Um, I mean, they work pretty well for us, so maybe they'll work good for your house too. So another pretty standard GMP that can be checked for an internal audit is personal hygiene. People can be a big cause of food safety issues because they don't handle food properly. Whether it's because of their bad technique when doing the food processing, or maybe they just have a lot of bad habits that can cause food safety issues of their own. So one of the things that I check for an internal audit is make sure that people are practicing good hygiene. So they're keeping decently groomed. I mean, you don't have to be perfect, but you do have to at least, for example, keep your facial hair under control. Don't show up to work dirty. Shower on a regular basis. Don't stain your clothes and all that. That's pretty standard stuff. If you're going to handle food, make sure you wash your hands before and after work, in between breaks, after eating lunch and all that. You want to make sure your hands are clean before you start working, and so you'll be checking for that during an internal audit. Um, when working any sort of production line, especially, you don't want to allow any sort of jewelry on there. So things like watches, rings, and whatnot, you got to take those out. There's one exception that I know of, and that's a wedding band. So if you're married, you can still wear those. The main reason is that those wedding bands don't have a lot of like stones or any sort of like details on them that could like fragment and come off and like contaminate the food. They're just like plain rings of metal, and so that's actually been permitted in some facilities, as long as the gloves are worn over it. But anything fancier than that is a no-no. If you have a foot washing station, so some factories have like some sort of sanitary bath, you have to put your boots or your shoes through it before you can enter the rest of the facility or that area of the production room. So like a foot bath or a soaking thing, an employee has to go through that before going to his workstation. That's something that would be covered in a personal hygiene program. Um, Most factories require personal protective equipment of some kind. So not really a lab coat per se, but like something like a little bit thinner than that, like a smock. That's typically required. Hairnets, of course, and definitely gloves for sure. Especially when handling food by hand, you gotta wear those gloves. Very important. The only real thing I forgot on here is nail polish, but honestly, even that, as long as you cover it with gloves and don't use anything toxic, that shouldn't be too bad. Although those of you who work in food service, you can't even have that either. So, yeah, that's kind of a thing to keep in mind. Speaking of PPE, there's some additional equipment or uniform materials that you might need to wear. I sort of made a typo here. I meant to talk about work safety stuff later, but since I left it on here, I might as well. explain it a little bit before I talk about the other things on here. So there may be additional requirements for your uniform or the PPE you have to wear, but they may not necessarily be for food safety reasons. They may be for your safety. So that's called occupational health and safety or worker safety. That may not be especially like 100% relevant to GMPs, but it's still something that you have to comply with. And if you're working QA, that's something you still got to check for an internal audit checklist. Um, so stuff like wearing helmets, for example. If your company deals with a lot of heavy machinery, some of which is overhead, or there's a lot of like different stacks in the warehouse, like your warehouse is super tall and a lot of things can fall over. A helmet would definitely be required, and you have to discipline any, or not you, but the production manager has to discipline any sort of worker who doesn't comply with that, because that's an OSHA or occupational health and safety risk. Um, I actually have to wear steel-toed boots and earplugs to work because it's very noisy in there, and some things can still drop on my feet and cause a lot of injuries there. So they want to protect that from a liability standpoint. Um, if you're working on the storage side, you may not necessarily need to wear a smock. You might need to wear like a one of those like coats that you see construction workers wear, where it's like bright orange, because you need to be easy to see when people are driving heavy machinery. That might be another work safety related sort of thing. All right. Anyway, with that addressed, that's what I meant by worker safety requirements that you need to check for. Let's talk about the food safety other additional requirements here. So for hairnets, there's actually a specific way that you need to wear them, and not everyone does this, but it's really the best way to go. So what you want to do is when you wear your hairnet, you got to completely cover your head, and not just your head. You have to cover all of your hair, as well as your ears, if possible. So if you have long hair, for instance, you have to tie it back or like tie it into a bun. My current boss does that sometimes, actually. Um, and then you have to wear your hairnet over that and make sure that all your hair is covered. Um, Now with COVID-19, a lot of employees are required to wear face shields in addition to face masks. So on top of it, uh, I remember interviewing at Bacavor. That's a company here in Carson, and they actually issued face shields even to people who were interviewing. So that was kind of cool. When it comes to gloves, not just any gloves would do. You have to use ones issued by the company. It's because if they see any gloves contaminating the food, they want to know where it came from, whether it came from their company or if it came from defective raw ingredients coming from their supplier and whatnot. So that's another nuance that I want you to know. When you're wearing your smocks or your lab coats, they got to be of a specific design, one that avoids using any sort of loose buttons or zippers, because if that comes loose in your uniform, that could actually contaminate the food while you're working with it. So there are some that sort of like you tie them together instead. That's actually the kind that I use now. And so you got to avoid certain lab coat designs even to try to ensure food safety. So yeah, as you can see, a lot of things can go wrong when it comes to people, and that's kind of why GMP training is a necessary component of any sort of food safety program. Even if the employee did food safety training in another company, there might be special requirements at the new one that they have to take into account, and the company's responsible for it. So that's kind of why you have to go through GMP training every year and with every company that you join. Speaking of employees, here's one that is surprisingly hard to enforce. This one is eating habits. So when it comes to eating, you only want to eat in certain designated areas of the facility, whether it's a break room or maybe it's just some picnic benches out on the outside of the premises, near the office windows. If your office is located far away from the factory production area, you could eat there too, as long as there's no like obvious gate connection between the two, like um, or I should say there's as long as there's some distance between the two. That's probably a better way to phrase it. You could probably eat in there. That's fine. Um, you're actually allowed to smoke on at some companies, but that's actually even stricter than eating. You have to not only smoke away from the production area, but you have to also smoke in a designated smoking area because the smoke and the ash can actually contaminate the food or cause other safety issues too. So that's something that you have to take into account and also enforce if you're in QA. Uh, and one really bad habit that a lot of warehouse workers in particular tend to have, at least in my experience from working in the industry, is they have a tendency to hide food in their lockers, and that's not good either because that attracts pests, especially ants. So locker inspection is actually a pretty common thing that I check for, or something that I often did when conducting internal audits. And I want to say about 75% of the time I see food in there, which is no good. workers have to either store food in the refrigerators in the break room, or stored into the dry cabinets in the break room. They cannot store it anywhere else. That break room is specifically designed to isolate people's like lunches and food from entering the facility. You even have to check for evidence of eating in the trash bins in the facility. I've actually seen people bring their lunches into the storage area of the warehouse on the second floor of a building, and that's I mean that's a flagrant disregard for GMPs, but that's just some things that you have to deal with. Um, I once spilled someone's coffee by accident while trying to look for something else, and so I had to mark that down as someone hiding coffee in the warehouse as another GMP violation. And although I've never encountered it myself, I've heard stories of people actually hiding like cereal bars or like protein bars like under their forklift seats, like they're just eating while on the go. That's no good either. That's definitely something you want to check for. I don't know how frequent that is, but apparently it happens. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but actually, believe it or not, that's by no means exhaustive. And I'm actually not even satisfied with all the items that we covered this week. There's a lot more things that you typically need to check for an internal audit, and I want to cover them next week. For now, what I want you to do is just take these items into consideration along with the GMP's lecture and start creating a list for yourself that you want to like take into account, like if for your own like food safety program. Um, we'll talk about other things that are typical to an internal audit next week. Um, there are definitely going to be some other items that I need to put on there that are pretty important. It's just that if I list them all today, they'll be here for like 2 hours. So I have hard enough time to get a dish to you guys on time as it is. So we'll definitely talk about that next week. More items that you need to check in an audit. This is pretty important stuff. So we'll get to that when we get to that. I have a couple resources for you to work with in case you need some more background or introduction to this particular concept. Um, as I promised, I would add more GMP videos to the YouTube channel that's actually up right now. If you look in the YouTube channel, there's a list called Recommended Videos GMPs. Um, there'll be a bunch of videos for you guys to look at, and it'll talk about internal auditing GMPs, how to conduct food safety audit, and stuff like that. And there's actually some detailed webinars on the subject, which are pretty long and pretty dry, but something I feel like would actually be a lot of help for you to listen to. So I would give that a look. If you want a list of things that GPs to look at for your project, some links for that too. I even have a website for how to identify different types of droppings, including the ones that we listed. There are a lot of other different types of pests, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's worth looking at for that as well. Uh, on Canvas, I have two different handouts in the Lab 7 of the recommended readings, or Week 7, I should say. There's a PDF on food safety audit, and there's another list of GMPs that you guys can look at, just to introduce you to the concept in more detail. And there's even an article on how to deal with rats in the warehouse. Sorry, hiccups. That's another thing I want you to look at. So I actually have some comments as far as how to apply this lesson to your project. Your project actually requires an internal audit component. So not only a list of the things that you check, you guys need to have a hypothetical example of what you guys would look for in a typical audit, like just as if you're filling it out as if you're touring a normal factory. Make a note of something that went wrong and make a correction. That's sort of the requirement behind it. And I'll talk about it more in class on Tuesday. Um, the best way to do it is you guys are working on a particular product for your company, right? Hopefully you guys have an idea of what the process is like, what steps to go into it, how you guys are planning to store this equipment, or sorry, store the ingredients that you have, how you guys are planning to like ship it out and stuff like that, how you guys are planning to process it. Um, just think about like some of the things that you want to check for as far as like whether or not it's going smoothly. Like you want to check how what your employees are wearing. You want to check if certain equipment is functioning properly. How are you going to deal with security and stuff like that. If it would help, I would suggest drawing like a crude map, like sort of similar to the floor plan that I showed you guys last time, and just sort of thinking like theoretically, like how could there be a potential food safety issue with the way our building is set up. That might be a little bit hard to imagine. I'll be happy to like give you guys some suggestions, but just go through that exercise first. Just discuss it with the group, like what could go wrong here, what could go wrong there, and sort of build a list based off that. So you basically my point being is you want to build an internal audit checklist. You want to pretend to go through like one of those like as if you're like doing an inspection of a real factory, and then just like note some of the things that went wrong, make a correction list, fill it out. I'll see if we can provide you guys some visual examples next week. But that's just kind of what I want you to do with it. As far as if you need inspiration for what kind of things you want on that checklist, so I didn't complete that last point there, but what you want to do is create a list of the things that you would probably check if you want to maintain food safety in your facilities. Like obviously pest control would be a big one. You want to check to make sure that your facility is designed, or sorry, your facility condition is maintained in such a way that nothing's broken, for example. Are people following food safety instructions or working in the warehouse? Like, what do you do if something that doesn't go as planned, or employees are not following the rules, stuff like that? Take that into consideration. You can even base it off just the GMPs from this lecture or the last one. You can use this presentation as inspiration if you really need to, as well as the next one. Um, Everything I covered, like I said, would be pretty typical of most food safety audits. So you can basically just base your list off that if you really wanted to. And I'll provide a template when I have the chance. All right, so you actually have an assignment for this week, but it will not be due until I think the week after next week, because there's some additional comments I need to make about this. But as far as what you can do now, pick an area in your life, whether it's your room, a place that you shop, a restaurant that you go to a lot, any place where there's going to be a lot of food being served, prepared, or eaten, and sort of create a checklist based on that. Obviously, not everything's going to apply 100%, because like at your house where you're going to have a dumpster, right? And I would 100% understand if you didn't have like a groundskeeper for your own house. You might have one for your apartment complex, maybe, but um, whatever the case, just pick any sort of environment that you frequent a lot. Like maybe it's your house, grocery store, like I said, a place that you study a lot on campus. That might be hard to do with COVID, but you get my point. Just any place that where there might be food eaten or prepared somewhere, and sort of build a checklist based on that. Like just based on both the environment and the things we covered in the lecture. If you're immunocompromised or have a relative who is, no problem. If you really must, you can just do your own apartment room or your house. Um, that way you don't have to expose yourself just for an assignment. This week, just focus on understanding the material covered here as well as the GMP lecture, and then just sort of start planning for your future audit. This is kind of like step one of that internal audit process. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me or leave a comment here in the YouTube section channel. And otherwise, I will see you next week.